Okay. I think we're make sure that that's streaming properly. I think I just got the email that says it is. Do, do, do. Great. Okay, so the all my technology seems to be running out of batteries, so hopefully I can get the day done. Do, 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 do. Okay. So when did here last time? Just as I said, a bunch of inventions that came out in a pretty small period of time. I mean, between the 1860s and 1900, we went from, telegraph lines, which, I mean, this is still a pretty big deal, running across the Atlantic, and then all the various technologies that would eventually become just commonplace stuff today, although I still don't entirely know what that's supposed to be. Skyscrapers, Otis elevator, which I'll get to in just a second, of course, telephone, steel production, oil industry, and just kind of as I mentioned last time, class was almost over by the time we got to this part, so just to kind of reiterate here, the oil industry originally was more for lubrication than like power, and for the most part, power was kerosene. It was oil for burning lamps, not running engines. Because, I mean, if you're familiar at all with how an internal combustion engine works, it's a metal box with explosions in it. Um, it has to be manufactured really, really specifically, or you're just giving people a gas power bomb. So for the most part, kerosene, um, and then like the more inert oil for lubrication, gasoline was actually considered a waste byproduct because it burned too fast. It was just um, too much for what they needed it for. And then, of course, other things you can use petroleum for. Um, Vaseline being the name brand. Yeah, that's petroleum jelly. FYI. Um, Last name? Holiday. Okay. Just making sure I got everybody. Alright. Cool. Okay. And, then of course, as I said, the cars didn't really come out until a little bit later. And again, not Henry Ford. We'll get to Henry Ford a little bit later, but there was no like single inventor of cars. As I mentioned last time, this is Mr. Benz of Mercedes-Benz, and this is one of the very early working models, because they had a lot of models that just didn't work, or like would sort of go, and then that was about it. It's like comparing, well, not even, I was gonna say like the Wright brothers, essentially glider to a modern day jet plane, but even then, like that was a major step compared to what had been before. So, yeah, this was a gradual sliding scale. Okay, before I get on to the next thing, I want to pull up this. Let's see. Does that? No, it does not. Great, awesome. So I get to do it over here. So just sort of a little aside. As I may have mentioned, I work at the Otis Elevator Company here in Florence as a security guard. So while I'm not like in there actually doing anything, I am typically close with what's going on. I'm going to talk about GE more in just a minute because I also did security at a GE, and when you're working there, they're all very open about the technology. They're proud of what they're doing. They're impressed by their own stuff. So this is the Florence factory. It's right down, honestly, like in Irby Street almost. This is the testing tower. I've had a lot of people ask questions about that. They have 6 hoistways, as they call them, using the terminology that the plant supervisor suggested I use, where they just like drop elevators and test, the lines and the electronics and whatnot. Because again, Otis, the name is from, obviously Elisha Otis. He founded the factory or the company, and it's all about safety brakes. It's not that he invented the elevator. That's been a thing since forever. But elevators that won't kill you, like 50% of the time. Anyway, I'm going to go through this. This is the little slideshow that the plant supervisor had and sent to me because I was like, hey, is there anything you'd like me to tell my students about the Otis Elevator Factory out here? She's like, yes, let me send you stuff. She was very excited. So, this is just what they tell people when they're doing tours. Obviously, we're not worried about all the details here. I just wanted to bring this up. But what is interesting is that the factory here in Florence, I say it while we're standing in Lake City, the factory in Florence is apparently the only one in North America that actually makes the full chassis, the full car and electronics and all of that. The one in Connecticut, where the headquarters is, apparently, only does modernizations. They only do upgrades to older existing elevators. So, again, according to the plant supervisor, if you've ridden in an elevator in a building newer than 2012, it was made here in Florence. So that's kind of neat. There's like speaking of the tower here, this is where I sit on Saturdays, including the last couple of Saturdays when it was extremely cold. This thing is not well insulated. And then now you have to walk over here because this is the closest bathroom. But there's a lot of little things like this just sort of in that hall. They clearly bring people in there for tours as well. But there's like massive, much bigger towers in like Southeast Asia, apparently. There's one that's like several times the size of that one, and it's also underground. Yeah, so anyway, just real quick, obviously we know about this part, Elisha Otis and the safety brake, hydraulic passenger elevator, 1878. All right, it's not over here. 1950 without an intent. So for a long time, you had to ride an elevator with somebody actually running the thing. Again, if you've seen any old movies or even like cartoons from back in the day, there was always like the stereotype of the person who opens the doors and selects the number and pulls this big lever. And then they're talking about like more advanced stuff, but we're not worried about that. This is the actual plant. Again, I'm not worried about that. Cool, second robot installed. I don't care. But it did start in 2012. Again, they have the testing tower. They also do manufacturing there. So it's just neat that the one here in Little Florence is like one of their bigger plants. That's kind of neat. So yes, 6 hoistways, 126 feet tall, and it's got various labs and whatnot inside that tower. These are stuff to the floor. I think that's it. Yep. But yeah, like I said, I just thought that would be worth sharing since the plant supervisor was eager to send that to me. Let's see, let's just go ahead and go to the next one here. Obviously, you're not going to need to know any of that for any kind of test. I just like to share things that I learned. So, when it came to all these new technologies, obviously many of them funneled into the railroads because, again, railroads are like the main thing this chapter, or not this chapter, these last several chapters. Air brakes, automatic coupling devices. I'll get to that in just a little bit. Elijah McCoy, who was the son of former slaves, worked menial jobs despite being a trained engineer because racism. And one of the things he had to do was like lubricating the gears so they wouldn't literally burst into flames. You run these machines too long and too fast, they just catch on fire. Metal will catch on fire, FYI. Or as the joke goes, any machine is a smoke machine if you run it incorrectly enough. So he invented this automatic lubricating device so that the trains could just keep running. They'd have to stop every few miles, and you have to like oil everything down so it doesn't explode. So that was good. So a lot of these early inventions, particularly the previous slide, were individuals, like we've been seeing with everything else, because again, they call this the age of organization. Things gradually become more consolidated. It's over here. For example, 1876, Thomas Edison created this so-called invention factory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, where he would bring together groups of inventors to work together under a single roof to just create stuff. In his words, genius was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, which is to say it's just a lot of hard work. You don't just wake up one day and have this fully formed genius idea that you just make happen. So he expected that the factories produce a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so, which is quite a way to automate inventions, but sure. Over the course of his lifetime, he filed almost 1,100 patents. That said, most of these were, his workers who did the inventions. But because they were working under him, he got the credit. Some of the stuff he's famous for, obviously the light bulb, incandescent light bulb specifically, phonograph, motion pictures, a lot of things that again are just like normal, everyday, modern things that were at least created in a more modern form in this era. The light bulb was an especially big deal because it allowed people to live and work even during the nights, whereas before it was gas lamps, and the way you make gas lamps run is you have metal pipes throughout your house pumping natural gas into the fixtures, and they burn a nice little small flame at the best of times. And similar to when you have pipes in your house for your plumbing, sometimes there's a leak, except for this, when there's a leak, your house bursts into flames. So those kind of needed to be phased out. There was this whole, it was not like he invented light bulbs and everybody moved to that. It took decades before this real full adoption of electricity and light bulbs and whatnot, but obviously it was a big step. Furthermore, Edison got extremely rich through all of this. He worked with J.P. Morgan to form the Edison Electric Company in 1882, and then within 10 years merged with several competitors to form the General Electric Corporation. So there's GE. So we've had AT&T. we didn't really talk about Otis Elevator, the company, but I mean Elisha Otis and the safety elevator. So that's that. Um, and then yeah, here's GE. So, couple of things. The air brakes, very important. Now, this sort of derailment was not super common. Most of the times, you can kind of see from the way the train car is sitting. These train cars were light and made of wood. And a lot of times when they would derail, it was literally they like hit the tracks wrong and sort of skipped off the tracks, and the train had to stop. And most of the time, the conductor would just come through and like get all. Well, at first everybody would have to get off the thing, make it as light as possible. Then get like all the able-bodied men, and they would just like lift or just push the train car back onto the tracks. Things were simple back then. However, when derailings did happen, it was bad. Because, again, these things are made of wood. I was reading about this for a different class, and, like, sometimes the train would hit the track in such a way that the rail would lean up and go through the car, basically spear the car with the rail. Granted, this was back when rails were like wood or iron, so not as strong as steel, because steel stays where it is usually. All that to say, it was pretty dangerous. So, air brakes. This is the air brake system. You pump air into the system here, and it applies the brakes, and then it goes into the next car, and likewise, well, this is actually the system here, and then it goes back this way. I'm doing it in reverse. Before that, bring us back up, each car had its own set of brakes, and the way to engage them was with a physical lever. So if a train needed to suddenly slam on the brakes, a conductor had to run through the train, pull each lever, and then like go to the next car and hit the next one, which is bad enough. Worse when it's like boxcars, so there isn't any lovely inside to be in. They had to run along the tops of the boxcars, pull the lever while the train's moving, jump to the next one, and do that again. A lot of conductors were lost that way. So not only is this significantly more convenient, because you activate a valve in usually the locomotive itself, and it pumps air through and just hits the brakes on everything at once, it was a hell of a lot safer. Same with the automatic coupling devices, which I grew up with model trains, so like they had these. You had the two cars, and you pushed them together, and they would just like link automatically, because it's just shaped like two hands essentially, and they push against each other, and then when they pull back, they're locked in place. Now, obviously, you still had it locked, like the air brake system, and usually they would have like something here to make sure that stay together just in case. But again, before, they would have to back the cars up to one another and then hook this up manually, which obviously didn't look like that. And people would get killed because sometimes the train would be backing up too hard and would just smash the cars together. And the human body is not made for that. Less of an invention when it comes to getting people killed less. This is the automatic lubrication device. Obviously, it's a cutaway, so you can see what the inside looks like. Significantly more convenient, a lot less work for everybody involved. I don't know, I'm sure people died trying to lubricate these spinning bits of machinery. It's the 1800s. All right, what else do we have? Oh, Menlo Park. This was the initial Menlo Park. And then that's the inside. If you've ever had any kind of like basic chemistry lab, this would look familiar. You got the the hard, cold metal tables, a bunch of test tubes. One thing that this is specifically missing, which we'll see in the next picture as well, no kind of ventilation. Again, if you've been in any kind of lab that has any sort of chemicals, and FYI, the chemicals that you'll be dealing with in any sort of high school or even college level lab, they're like, oh, this is hydrochloric acid. Be careful, it'll burn you. I watched my professor wash his hands with it before. It is so diluted. Not to say don't follow proper safety, because that's literally the point of the lab, is to make sure you know how to do safety in the case of a real lab. But also there's always vents to suck the air out in case there's some sort of chemical spill. Back then they obviously didn't have that. So if you had a chemical spill, you just suffocated. This is the one, I think this is also in New Jersey, but obviously this is in town. And on the inside it's a little bit more organized. Also something else that they didn't have originally, these fire suppression systems. So again, if you had a chemical spill that started a fire, you were just kind of out of luck. I don't think too much of that happened with these in particular, because I feel like they would have been mentioned in the book at the very least. But just FYI, most of what they had was this little metal fan here. All right. Then of course the light bulb, which in itself is the result of, to use Edison's quote, 10,000 failures. The light bulb is a real delicate piece of technology, because first off, you have to create a vacuum. There has to be no air inside this bulb. And again, 1800s technology, they didn't exactly have vacuum pumps lying around. And then they had to get the correct filament to run electricity through to heat up enough that it would produce light, but not heat up so much that it would just pop. Because again, not that we have that many incandescent light bulbs anymore, but when a light bulb would go bad and you shake it, you would hear a rattle around. That's when the filament finally did pop, just from age. So yeah, there's a lot to making the light bulb. But also, it wasn't just Edison that did it 10,000 times. It was all his workers. So, but hey, he, got the credit for it. Now, we can't talk about Edison without at least mentioning Nikola Tesla. Tesla worked for Edison for a time. Disagreed with Edison on the use of, I believe, AC, alternating current electricity, versus DC, which is direct current. AC is the kind of current that you would have in basically anything. Light sockets, your car, whatever. Whereas direct current is typically batteries, because is electricity flowing from the battery into the thing, and that's about it. Alternating current is always moving. And there was a whole fuss over that, and Edison got rid of him, and then also used his significant pull in the government to ruin Tesla, because Tesla went to Westinghouse, which was a competing electric company, and Westinghouse did really, really well for a while. But it's oh, well, Tesla's not American, he's a Serbian immigrant, therefore he's a problem. And yeah, I'm not going to glaze Tesla too much, but yeah, Edison was a piece of garbage. And Tesla should have gotten a better shake. So here's the Edison Electric Company, again, placed by the water for convenience of shipping. Here's a larger one, which is placed by the railroad tracks for convenience of shipping, also by the river. You can see there's that extra shipping. And then we have just a random GE plant that I was able to find. I wasn't able to find like a super old one, so here's, but it's got like the really old, a really big sign with the old symbol on it. The one that I worked at upstate was much smaller, but they made airplane engine parts, the little tiny blades that go inside jet engines. And I don't know why we didn't have a fence, because that we literally had like Department of Defense contracts, but whatever. Geez, weird. Which is, I kind of point that out here, is you've got this really nice wrought iron fence, at least where you can see in the visitor's entrance, and then once you get far enough out, it just goes back to chain link. That doesn't mean anything, but I just like to make note of it. All right, so on to the next section. Here we are. So there was this idea of the New South as opposed to, pre-Civil War. Those that were proponents of this, such as Henry Grady, the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, felt that the reason that the South lost the war was due to the North's superior manufacturing output and railroad supply lines, which isn't completely untrue. I don't remember if it's actually when we get to the Civil War in my 101 course, or if it's in the technology course that I taught before, but I have an image of Union soldiers on like a flat car on a train with an artillery piece, which is just to say a real big cannon. That's the sort of thing we didn't have down here. We didn't have like any kind of industry. We were content just to do the slave labor thing and not invest in manufacturing. So when the war happened, we were at a major disadvantage. Meanwhile, we have folks like Richard Edmonds, who himself was the editor of the Manufacturer's Record, said that the real South had the music of progress, the whir of the spindle, the buzz of the saw, the roar of the furnace, and the throb of the locomotive. In his mind, the South should probably get with the rest of the country technologically, because otherwise the economy is never going to recover. And we can still be our own, like, distinct entity, and also be in the, at the time, 19th century? Technology-wise. Once again, railroads. Railroads were the big part of all of this, in particular economic integration. It allowed for the North and the South to be more closely connected, so things could be shipped back and forth more readily. And initially that would be for what we'd always been doing of, we make the raw resources down here, ship them elsewhere, and be done with it. However, due to the increased industrialization of the South, the textile industry also grew down here. So rather than just growing the cotton, due to the depressed wages in the South, they were able to keep labor cheap. So when they built these textile mills, the people working there worked for much less than they did up north. And then you've got the locomotive running the cotton to the textile mills, and then from the textile mills to various stores. Particularly in Georgia and the Carolinas, I made this comment to my Tuesday, Thursday class. I knew someone who lived in Columbia, went to USC, and was living in Columbia while they were there, and their apartment was in an old textile mill. They just gutted the inside of the textile mill and built apartments. They just built floors in there that wouldn't have been in there originally. So like the top floor was these big loft apartments because, again, textile mills were real tall. And you can only really go so high before you start hitting weird architecture that wouldn't work for living there. So they just had really high ceiling. And once again, not just cheap labor, but owners would typically hire girls and young women who they could pay less because 1800s. Although oftentimes they'd have to hire the entire family because fathers wouldn't let their daughters move out alone. Typically, these fathers would come in and work as supervisors just to ensure their daughters weren't getting up to trouble or whatever. And for the most part, this would help white families across the board because farming had never been a stable form of income. And while that was like the form of income for most of human history, which I'll get more into in a little bit, if the crop prices shift, you lose everything. But at least with this, you were working a punch clock job, and if cotton prices shifted, yeah, they might lower your wages, but usually you'd keep your job. That said, black families typically were left with only the most menial of jobs, which is to say they were in the fields again. They were technically being paid for it, but barely. And then when they weren't being paid for it at all, we just used the 13th Amendment for the convict labor system. Because again, those imprisoned are not subject to the 13th Amendment, which is to say, technically slavery is legal if you're in prison. And with the black codes, which made being black in America basically illegal, there was plenty of black labor to be had. So they were hired out by private companies to serve their time or pay out fines, which brought in a lot of money to the local governments and provided cheap labor for the companies. However, as was the intention, African American workers were impoverished and essentially enslaved again. Just now through the law of the state. I mean, not that slavery wasn't law of the state before, but now it's like, oh, well, technically, yeah. Let's see. Here we have Henry Grady. I think he's the one that wrote, yeah. Henry Grady's New South, Atlanta, a brave and beautiful city. Clearly, this was an Atlanta from long ago. No, my only beef with Atlanta is the traffic is horrendous. The last time I was anywhere near Atlanta, it was like one of the suburbs. It was a city technically outside of Atlanta, and you were still hitting Atlanta traffic. Like my dad complains about the traffic in Florence, like, oh, this is the most ridiculous traffic I've ever seen. It's like, you've never been to a large city. It's a lot of traffic for Florence, but that's just because we haven't built, the infrastructure isn't enough for it yet. But like, it's not bumper to bumper sitting on the interstate stopped traffic. You don't see that around here. So yeah, anyway, getting ahead of myself. So here we have the wealth distribution throughout the country. As you can see, concentrated in the north, particularly around the ports, and also the rivers, which were, used for much of the same thing, and California because of, the gold rush and all that, and not a lot going on down here. I think I already mentioned. No, I haven't talked about Birmingham yet. Yeah, Birmingham only exists because of iron ore that they found. We'll get that in a minute. Railroads, again, really heavily concentrated up north, and then also around like Chicago. I mean, Chicago was a hub, kind of really still is, of railroad. And then as you get down here, it's less. I mean, that's not quite as bad as out here in the middle of nowhere, but not nearly as much. And honestly, compared to, if you ever look at like a European map of railroads compared to a United States map of railroads, Europe looks like this. We look like this by comparison. Happy times in the textile mills. Again, these big belts whirring right next to your head. If you got caught in it, you don't work here anymore. Assuming, I mean, if you even survive it. And just kind of give you an idea, I want to talk about how big these textile mills were. They were big. When you're looking at an image and you can't see the far wall because it just sort of fades, that's a big plant. Now, granted, again, you know, quality of photography back then, but still, that's a lot. And then, of course, the black families were not even allowed into the factories to make the slightly more money that young women made, young white women made. And then, worse than that was, of course, the convict labor system, which just used, well, slave labor, essentially. And again, most of these people were jailed for crimes that included existing in America with melanin in your skin. Is this the one with, yeah. So here's a book written about this era called One Dies, Get Another. Convict Leasing in the American South, 1866 to 1925. And then the quote down here really says it all. Before the war, we owned the Negroes, a Southern businessman reflected nostalgically. If one man had a good Negro, he could afford to keep him, but with the convicts, we don't own them. One dies, get another. So, again, not to be like, oh, well, see, slavery wasn't that bad, because somehow that's like an argument now. But, like, at least during slavery, when the people were being owned, especially after the transatlantic slave trade ended and we couldn't just go get more people, slaves were at least valued in the same way one would, value livestock. But with this, they have no value to the white businessman. Work them till they die. Who cares? Well, is the government going to get upset that a prisoner died from work? No. So, yeah, it was real bad. And as you can see, it went much longer than just like the 1800s. I mean, 1925. And again, technically, it still is a thing. Convict labor very much is a thing. It's all still on the books. All right, more New South stuff. So the New South is more than just railroad and textiles, and actually just, again, to pull from my own background, I remember my grandmother talking about, her big thing was make sure you get a good education so you can have a good job. She was raised during the Great Depression. So, like, she was raised during a time of economic uncertainty. And her big thing was make sure that you are stable. She was all about, make sure you get a good job so you can have money just to live. And we were talking about, like, I don't know, different jobs, different, sorts of things. I think I wanted to go into veterinary at the time. And she was saying, oh, well, doctor stuff, that's what's big today. But used to be, it was textiles. And I was thinking she meant, like, in her time, like the 1920s, 30s, 40s, she was talking about this. She was talking about like late 1800s, which I guess, to be fair, her parents probably lived through, so that's what she grew up hearing. But it was just weird hearing her talking about textiles were the big thing, like it was what she did as, a young adult. Um, old folks have long memories. So anyway, pushing past textiles, we have James B. Duke in North Carolina. He established his cigarette manufacturing empire. So anything, at least when it comes to this region of the country, that's named Duke is this guy. Duke University, Duke Power, which I know he didn't form Duke Power, but I'm sure they just used the name to be like, hey, we're part of this heritage too. Duke University was basically founded by this guy because he had so much money. He was just doing, like Carnegie said, philanthropy. We're not there yet. That's later in the chapter. I'm getting ahead of myself. But basically, you give money to these institutions to help the poor without actually, like, helping to feed the poor because that's their responsibility. So that's why that is. Technically, also, I guess I should say this because otherwise I'm too pedantic. It's not named after him. It's named after his father. It's like he gave this huge grant to the university, and they were going to name the university after him. He's like, oh no, we can't do that. That makes me seem too self-centered. You can name it after my father, but it's not whatever the hell his father's first name is, Duke University. It's just Duke University, and this is the one we all remember. So, yeah. Anyway, cigarette companies works the way you think it would. The tobacco fields are typically worked by black families because, again, they would get the bottom rung. The tobacco will be sent into the factories to be rolled into cigarettes by machine, which, as we'll see here in a bit, was typically done by, again, young white women because they could be paid less than white men. Also, lots of lumber to be had in the Carolinas, Florida, Alabama, etc. Which it's nice that we're still pretty heavily forested region-wise. It feels like every time you turn around, there's like another area that's been cleared out for a bank or a strip mall or whatever. But when you actually go into one of the few tall buildings we have, for example, visiting my grandparents in the Carolinas Hospital, you look out and you can't even see buildings. It's just all forest. So that's nice. And as I mentioned with Birmingham, Alabama, they discovered a lot of iron and coal underground there. So it turned Birmingham from probably wasn't hardly anything into probably one of the biggest cities in the Southeast. And by 1900, was producing a million tons of steel. Still, though, despite all this, the New South was not that different from the Old South. When it came to actually jump-starting these projects, it was typically northern investors who came down and used the cheap labor and raw resources of the South to make a product cheaply and then sell it for profit. And those that were actually working in these factories were typically making so little they couldn't even afford what was being made. For example, like, I guess, the cigarette factories would be a good one. You're sitting there rolling cigarettes all day, but you're not making enough to even buy a pack. Let's see. Right. And despite these industries, despite iron and coal and railroads and textiles, a lot of this was still just farming. A lot of it was agrarian. And even to try to diversify crops met with resistance, because the little sharecroppers who were the most numerous, their plot of land was so small that they couldn't, there wasn't room to diversify crops. They had to grow whatever would get them the most profit so that they could survive. Which meant that, again, if everyone's growing the same thing and flooding the market with it, the prices are going to drop and they're going to lose everything. But that's hard to see when you're starving and you see that, wheat is this much more than, say, corn or whatever, so you're just going to grow wheat, but so is everyone else. And yeah, the economy is a terrible thing. Also, those who were actually in control in the South, the Southern elite, wanted to keep things the way they were. While they couldn't go back to before the war, they could still hold on to keeping everyone poor and using forced systems of labor. So it wasn't exactly the way it was before the war, but it sure wasn't that different. Things were just slightly more industrialized. And technically, slavery wasn't a thing. Asterisk. Comic labor. James B. Duke. Again, if you lived in North Carolina, or really just spent any amount of time in North Carolina, you've probably seen this guy's picture at some point, even if you didn't know what you were looking at. If this was Duke University, I wouldn't even need to talk about this, because I'm sure that everyone knows about this guy. Let's see. So this is what the cigarette factories look like. Again, the rolling machines weren't like modern day automation where you just let it do the whole thing, but it was at least machine assisted rolling so that the cigarettes would be of uniform size and I guess tobacco density. I don't know what the proper term there will be. Because A, you need to be able to fit however many would normally go into a packet, and again, they need to be standardized and uniform. Otherwise, some people will be getting more for the same price than others. It's the whole thing. Anyway, again, as you can see, young women working there. This is an image of cigarette factory workers. Not, as one might assume without context, a picture of an all-girls school. No, these are workers at a cigarette factory. Because again, they can just be paid less. Child labor was alive and well. And then, of course, when it came to actually picking the tobacco, it was left to black workers. Now, this is obviously a much more recent image. You've got a gas-powered, that's a modern tractor right there. Well, I say modern. Modern, relatively speaking, tractor. So this isn't quite 1800s, but same idea. I mean, if you've ever been down any country road at all, and even 52, you run into them. You've seen tobacco fields. You know what tobacco fields look like. Lumber, the forests throughout the southeast, which again, are still pretty heavily forested around here, which is nice. I included this image because when I was making this PowerPoint initially, I was upstate, and while they of course do still have pine trees upstate, it's not like it is down here where like 80% of the trees are pine. And then if you just turn off any road, you're now on like a clay red dirt road, and you're surrounded by pines. So I wanted to include that for a little bit of nostalgia's sake when I was working upstate. They've got more. I don't remember the term. It's been so long since I've had a basic biology course. But the regular trees with the leaves, as opposed to a conifer tree with the evergreen. I believe this is a mine shaft, or maybe that's part of an iron foundry, because I know there's this. Oh yeah, and then coal too. Hope you're not claustrophobic. Working coal mines sucked. It still does. I mean, it was that cave in. It wasn't that long ago. It was before. It was the first time I really heard about Elon Musk being the psycho. Where he was like questioning the morals of the people going in to save the coal miners. I don't know. We're not going to talk about that. Anyway, yeah, not great. Not great working conditions. And, there's your job site entrance. Now, that said, a lot of the early coal fields were surface coal. So they were just able to dig basically a small quarry and get coal that way. So it wasn't all underground, murder pits. You were able to just dig out a quarry. Quarries are still dangerous in their own way, but you're not underground. All right. On to industry. So besides these various types of industries we talked about, one of the main things that typified this era of history was how ruthless the business practices were. This is the time of the tycoons of industry, or as they're also known as robber barons, because they would wipe out their competition. As we saw with General Electric, it was formed by Edison Electric Company consolidating his competitors so that he didn't have other competitors now. He controlled the market. And if you know anything about General Electric, they do more than make light bulbs. You have, I'm sure, dealt with many GE products in your day-to-day life. They make everything. Basically every kind of appliance you can think of. Trains. I don't know if they actually make the whole airplane. Again, I know they make the engines for the airplane. Yeah, GE's got its hands in everything. So all that said, this machinery, this industrialization created a steep overhead cost, because in order to be able to start at the same level as all these other businesses, you needed to buy all this equipment. You couldn't just open, mom and pop's train factory. There was a lot you had to put in before you could do that. So with all this overhead cost, they had to find a way to make a profit, a big profit, elsewhere. So one was called the economy of scale. This was not mass production, but it was early what we would see now today as mass production. Poured out a bunch of product and saving on the actual cost of production by either paying their workers less or reducing the cost of manufacturing, which is to say, making sure that the machines were, how should I put it, as cheaply made as was possible and still run. Factory safety was not a thing. There's also vertical integration, where these captains of industry, or, again, rubber barons, would create a whole system as opposed to just making the final product. The example they used was Carnegie. Carnegie was the steel guy. He was the one that was producing, really, by the time they were done, most of the steel in the U.S. was made under Carnegie. But rather than just running the steel mills, he combined his operations with other individuals. One, for example, Henry Clay Frick, who we will talk about next chapter, who himself had access to a big coal business because coal is required to run the furnaces to turn iron into steel. So rather than risk coal prices going up or some other company deciding that, well, Carnegie needs all this coal and he's making a ton of money, so let's just charge more for coal. Now, within the same company, he's got access to the coal, so he's able to make the steel. I don't think Carnegie bought out the railroads. That's something that Rockefeller did later, where rather than, no, at first, Rockefeller had like deals with the railroads to ship his oil for cheap, and then they decided, well, they can make more money if they just charge Rockefeller more. He can afford it. So Rockefeller instead built oil pipelines to just completely avoid the railroads because he was that petty about it. Anyway, getting, again, a bit off there. By comparison, we have horizontal integration, where they basically eliminated competition. They would buy up any companies that were their competitor or starve them. So the example for this is, again, Rockefeller. In the 1870s, he combined the Standard Oil Company with several competitors to control 4/5 of the market. That's 80%. So he's got 80% of the oil market. There's a bunch of other smaller companies trying to compete with him. And when you control that much and you have access to that much profit, you can drop your costs, or not your costs, your prices for what you're, charging other people to almost, not even almost, to like break even prices, and they can sometimes even afford to go under that, where they're losing money because of how cheap he's running his oil. The reason for that is these other companies cannot afford to do that. They don't have the vast amount of wealth that Rockefeller had stored from owning 4/5 of the businesses. So the other companies would either sell to him so that they could get out with enough money to hopefully live a happy rest of their lives, or they just went out of business. And then, once they were all out of business, he would just raise prices back up to whatever was comfortable for him and make incredible profit. Similar to how the oil industries are doing today. Not doing, have already done. We're past this point. I know that there's there's several different types of gas stations. They all buy oil from the same place. There's maybe 3 real, true oil companies in the world. Same with food manufacturers. It's all under 2 or 3 big brands that all then have their little brands underneath them to make them look like there's more actually on the shelves. But yeah, this is still a thing. It's not supposed to be, because if you're familiar with what a monopoly is, this is a monopoly. This is controlling the entire market, which is technically illegal, but we'll get to that. Anyway, here's Carnegie. He had that sort of kindly grandfather look about him. He was a Scottish man. He was an older Scottish gentleman. And he did like to portray himself as a more benevolent type. I always compare him to Oh, nuts. Why can't I remember his name all of a sudden? Uh, I don't remember the old man in Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic Park, where he's like, "Oh, I'm just this eccentric old man who has a dream of opening a park with dinosaurs in it." But if you read the book, he was a monster. He was a he was Carnegie. He just wanted to make profit, cared nothing for the safety of anyone in the park, including his grandchildren. Um, and in the book, he doesn't make it, and it is probably the most karmic death in the Jurassic Park novels. Um, so yeah, portrayed himself as this kindly, benevolent guy. Actually, was an awful person. Yeah, it's pretty clear who certain characters are based on. Anyway, you've got your steel mills. I think I've got another one here. Oh, nope. So, this is Henry Clay Frick. This is the guy that he partnered with for the coal reserves, basically. And in case you're curious how that, I'm sure no one's curious about that, but in case you were curious about how that partnership went, here's a book about it. Meet You in Hell, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and the Bitter Partnership that Transformed America. We are going to talk about this in greater detail next chapter because some stuff happens that causes their opposing personalities to come to a head. And, hoo boy, Henry Clay Frick was kind of a madman. But again, we'll get to that. We're not quite there. Although I want to find this the USA Today blurb there. Meaningful, masterful. Stanford has a way of making the 1890s resonate with 21st century audience. I imagine there's a lot of drama in this because there just was. And if it's written well, I'm sure it could be fun. Here is, oh, right, sorry, one other thing. I am going to show you guys a documentary, well, not a it's not really a documentary, it's a History Channel series, so. A semi-accurate documentary on this era, and they did really good with Carnegie. So just kind of keep this picture in mind for when we get to the next chapter, because the guy they used for Carnegie was pretty close. Frick looked insane, so they did good with that. Rockefeller did not look like this in the little documentary. He looked like a man with a soul. Rockefeller does not. Rockefeller looks like something that would crawl out of a crypt in a horror movie. Rockefeller was a soulless monster, and he didn't care who knew it. Whereas Carnegie tried to pretend to be benevolent, Rockefeller did not. Granted, the guy that they did use for the documentary, he does look always angry, like he's ready to stab a puppy. But there's no beating the original. Anyway, here is some of his oil company or oil industries. Just these huge factories that you definitely don't need to worry about breathing. Also, these, you might have recognized that from, actually, do I have that here, or, yeah. The way these oil things were, you can't really see it here, but they're actually floating. That roof it's not a solid thing. It floats on top of the oil to keep the air out. So yeah, these really old oil containers have a very distinct look to them. Anyway, real quick, here is Standard Oil as this horrible, terrifying octopus monster getting its tentacles into everything, because boy did Rockefeller get his tentacles in everything. Government, getting into the White House, already in the, like, I guess this is the Senate and the House separately. And then over here, just, squeezing down the common man. They knew he was a horrible monster even back then. This wasn't something that was revealed later in history. Let's see, how much more Telegraph? I will do that later because there's a really great quote in that one. So, that's just a little bit of more of the Industrial Revolution here in the U.S. Once we get past these, we'll be able to move a little bit quicker. That said, the test isn't until we're done with this chapter, and we are not quite halfway through it, so it'll be a little while yet. Maybe I'm looking at probably next week. But again, if you've not had my class before, we do a study guide before the test. I will put that up on Blackboard as we get closer to the end of the chapter, so you'll be able to look it over and have an idea what we're going to be doing on review day. Other than that, unless anybody has any questions, I'll see y'all on Wednesday. Now that we finally had a full week. The night that I get 4 hours of sleep, I have to come in on a Monday. All right. Y'all take care.